afternoon, everyone. Today we're talking criminal justice reform and how that fits in with the conservative movement. Since the 1980s, when the war on drugs started and the tough on crime efforts were initiated, since that time period, our prison population has ballooned 800%. States on average are now paying $50 billion a year to maintain their jails and their prison populations. On a federal level, the Bureau of Prisons is taking up about 25% of the entire Department of Justice's budget, and it's the fastest growing. On the other hand, our streets have never been more safe. The crime rates have dropped dramatically since that time period, and a lot of people say that the rhetoric on the left of the low-level, nonviolent person put in jail for just having a little bit of marijuana is way overblown, that these are actually hardened criminals in jail, and as a result, our streets are safer. So we're going to have that debate today, and how we should approach this as conservatives. So we've got a great panel. We're going to start with Sheriff David Clark, who's on the streets every day fighting these. Former Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli of Virginia, who's at the state level enforcing this. And then Pat Nolan with ACU. He heads the Center for Criminal Justice Reform. He's been on all sides of it and has been an advocate for many people that have been caught within the system. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to open up. Everyone's going to have kind of an opening statement, if you will, of how, as conservatives, we should approach criminal justice reform, or does the system not need to be reformed at all? And so, Sheriff Clark, take the first stab at this.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Folks, you're not being told the truth when it comes to this criminal justice reform and sentencing reform, and I've called it the 3 lies of criminal justice reform, the 3 big lies. The first lie is that this will only involve low-level, nonviolent offenders. That makes up such a small portion of the prison population, either at the state or federal level. You would barely put a dent in the prison population if you just stuck with low-level, true low-level, nonviolent offenders. Lie number 2, it will reduce crime. You're smarter than that, okay? That flies in the face of getting tough on crime over the last several decades, and it has led to record low numbers of crime, violent crime, in your communities. Lie number 3, that it will reduce costs. Again, you're smarter than that. All this is going to do, at best, is shift the cost from the federal government down to the state level, because we know with the recidivism rate, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, being at about 67%, where within 3 years, 67% of these individuals will return to criminal behavior. They'll now be put into the state system, and so we will be incurring the cost. So all I want to have out of this is an honest discussion. Let's tell people the truth. And if we're not going to tell them the truth, I'm going to continue to resist. Tom Cotton is right on this. Jeff Sessions is right on this. Orrin Hatch is right on this. Ted Cruz is right in opposing this Trojan horse called criminal justice reform. Thank you.
All right. So, Mr. Cuccinelli, I think you probably have a different point of view.
I have a modestly different point of view, yes. I appreciate Sheriff Clark and his perspective on many issues and on parts of this one as well, because I do think his comments are well taken when you think about just a broad brush applied to this whole issue. And unfortunately, that's what the left tends to do. I belong to a coalition called Right on Crime, and it's conservatives, and we want to be right. And the number 1 job of state and local government is public safety. It's number 1. And I don't think anybody in this room is going to believe that anybody on the left thinks that's number 1, except maybe in lip service. I had the role as Attorney General of maintaining convictions we got in our localities, took that very seriously. Crime exists all over this country because evil exists all over this country, and it isn't going away. So how do we best deal with it? But how do we best deal with it with the limited tax dollars that we have? I think we can look to conservative states like Texas that have actually lowered their budgets for public safety because they have reduced crime. They've had both of those numbers go down in Texas, and one of Governor Perry's great accomplishments was overseeing criminal justice reform in Texas. Over the last 10 years, they have reduced both their budget for prisons and their crime rate by double-digit percentages, both at the same time. And they didn't do it by just across the board reducing a sentence for everything. They did it by targeting with particularity those areas of their criminal justice system where they could significantly lower recidivism rates, the most important statistic in criminal justice, arguably, while maintaining public safety. And did everything they do worked? No, and they got rid of the stuff that didn't. However, they did come across a number of things that made their system better and more cost effective. And I will tell you that if you want to see success stories, this will not shock you, don't look to Washington, but look out in the states. And it's not the Californias and the New Yorks of the world, it's the Texas, Georgia, in the Dakotas. That's where criminal justice reform that succeeds, which includes maintaining public safety, is happening. And we have evidence to provide other states that want to look at this that can cost effectively lower their crime rates and maintain public safety. Now, will we ever penetrate Washington with that kind of particularized thinking? Well, I hope so. Senator Lee certainly hopes so. It's worth trying in the sense that no one's beyond redemption and hope springs eternal, but we should work where we are in our communities and in our states to keep improving criminal justice from a conservative perspective. That is so important. We need to own this issue if it's going to be done right. The left can't own it. We got to own it.
All right. And Mr. Nolan, your kind of thoughts on how this plays into the conservative movement?
To put this in context, I had the blessing of working with Chuck Colson for over 15 years. And he was the pioneer. He was the first conservative that said, why on earth are we letting the same bureaucracy that runs the post office run the prisons? They don't do either very well. And the recidivism rate that Sheriff Clark refers to is an example of it not doing it very well. At its root, crime is a moral problem. That's the difference between criminal law and the civil law. Things like rape, robbery, murder, arson are inherently evil. You don't frankly need a statute to tell that. When Cain killed Abel, there was no law against it other than God's law imprinted on our soul that it's wrong to murder. Unfortunately, especially at the federal level, the statutes have gone far beyond those basic crimes. We now lock up people because they're lobster fishermen, and the laws of Honduras say you have to pack it in cardboard boxes, not plastic bags. They put it in plastic bags and did 8 years in the federal prison system.
U.S. federal prison.
Pardon me?
Even though it was Honduras law.
Right.
US federal prison.
There was no U.S. law against it. Pardon me. We lock up an elderly man that in retirement grew orchids, and the bill of lading put down the wrong type of orchid, and he was put in prison for that. We have Gibson Guitar, a business that we all know and appreciate, those of us that like music. SWAT teams from the Department of Interior invaded their 2 plants. At gunpoint and in flak vests, they held all the employees, and they seized wood used for their fretboards. Why? Because there's an the nation of India, labor law apparently, that says only Indian workers can work on their wood. Well, India approved its shipment to Gibson Guitar. How were they to know what the Indian local labor laws were? And yet the federal government prosecuted them. And who knew that the Department of Interior had a SWAT team? Well, my goodness. And the reason for no-knock laws is because people might destroy evidence, flush the drugs down the toilet. Well, were they afraid the Gibson employees were going to flush guitars down the toilet? Come on now. They didn't need to raid that, and yet this brutal attack on a business. Now, the interesting thing is, the owner of the company contributed to Republicans. All his competitors did the same with fretboards. None of them were prosecuted. None of them were raided. But he was. Now, the government has way overreached. We think, conservatives think, we should get back to basics. Robbery, rape, arson, mayhem. Those are the crimes that we should be going after. Prisons are for people we're afraid of, and yet more and more we're filling it with people we're mad at. Just a couple of statistics, and I admire Sheriff Clark so much, but the figures don't lie. Of those in prison, in federal prison, not state prison are where violent folks are locked up. The federal prison, over half are drug crimes. And of those drug crimes, only 14% were major traffickers. Why on earth are we going after street dealers? The federal government should be going after people that ship drugs across international borders and across state lines. Instead, the power of the federal government is used to go after people just trafficking, couriers. Now they shouldn't be doing it.
I'm going to disagree with you here.
Pardon me?
I'm going to interrupt. I'll let you finish your point, but because I've got different statistics from the DOJ from 2011 to 2012. Out of the 67,000 offenders, only 28 of those were prosecuted on drug possession alone.
No, I didn't say drug possession.
All right,
Okay,
but I mean,
drug crimes.
This is one of the problems, though, that I have with this.
If I could just finish for a moment.
Well, you've gone on for quite a bit now, and I just, you have. You said 3 minutes, I did 3 minutes, and I stuck to the rule. But now we're going to run out of time. But here, we can get into a battle of statistics, ladies and gentlemen, if you want, okay? Gentleman over here said figures don't lie. Well, I disagree. I think figures lie and liars figure, okay? But let's do this for a moment. Let's take away all the statistics. Let's take away all the rhetoric. Let's take away all the motion. Let's strip that away. And what do you have left? I'm at street level, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in the belly of the beast every day. And we totally dismiss this nonviolent drug offender, which is a myth. But you know what? If you're a struggling mom living in a slum or a ghetto city in the United States of America, and you're doing everything that you can to keep your kid away from that dope dealer standing on the corner who's out there every day and who is an influence, do you know that to get that guy off the street for as long as we can, allowed by law, is a big deal to her? She doesn't care about statistics.
Well, but Sheriff...
She doesn't care about statistics.
Sheriff, I grew up on Crenshaw Boulevard. I know about street-level crime, all right? I was a reserve deputy sheriff, fully post-certified in LA County at the second most violent substation, the Lakewood Station. So I know about violent crime. But the reality is the federal system, not you at the state level, the federal system, and this is from the Sentencing Commission that has all the data, 1/4 of those in federal prison for drug offenses had no prior history of violence. 0. Now, they're getting mandatory minimums of 5, 10, and 15 years. I'm saying sentence them under the regular sentencing law. Reserve the mandatory minimums for the dealers, the organizers. And yet the federal government, which is a bureaucracy, has only gone after the low-level folks. Only 14%.
No,
I'd like to get
true.
Mr. Cuccinelli's thought on this, because reducing mandatory minimums is it's being batted about in the Senate right now. It's a big talking point for both sides. You've seen the president grant clemency for a lot of low-level offenders that have been wrapped up into the system and that have overlong sentences. So how does that kind of what, as conservatives, what should our talking points be? And is there such thing as this low-level offender that's been in the system for way too long, that's been wrapped up by these mandatory minimums?
Well, part of what I hear being debated is what is a low-level offender,
Yeah.
and the statements each of them have made are right to a certain extent. And you know, it doesn't help us on the right when you've got a president who really looks like he's walking people out of prison. And if that's what criminal justice reform is, I want no part of it. But if we're going to control this, and I don't just mean the narrative, but if we're going to control the policy itself, then conservatives need to step up. And so we can use particularity and do the right thing, hit them hard where hitting hard makes the most sense. But we only have so many dollars. One of the problems at the federal level is, if you haven't noticed, we're bankrupt. And look at what states like California have courts ordering them to do. They are literally being ordered to open the prison doors because they don't have the money to handle their own system. And somewhere out there is a balance. Somewhere out there is a balance, but we should be trying to do it not just tough, that's a given, but right. So where do we spend those mandatory minimums? I'd ask a question out here to everybody. Let's talk about the toughest one of all, I think, gun crimes. Now, most of you don't know, but just shout out a number. How many years do you think is appropriate to automatically give, plus the sentencing that'll go over it, for a gun offense? If you deal drugs while using a gun, if you have, obviously, robbery using a gun, how many years? Just yell out some numbers. Let me hear some numbers. I heard mostly single digits. I heard 50 over here. But it's 15. It's 15 years, mandatory minimum. And I'm as tough on gun crime as they come. Richmond was, when I started as a young political activist, was the murder capital of America in the beginning of the 90s. And part of how that stopped is exactly what you heard from Sheriff Clark. But it was using those mandatory minimum sentences, but they were 3- and 5-year mandatory minimums, and it was used to clean up the streets in Richmond. It was a federal-state partnership. That mandatory minimum now is 15 years. Plus their sentence.
Nobody forces people to commit crime.
That's
All
true.
right, we're talking about a behavior choice here, and a culture change that's needed. You don't arbitrarily set prison population rates. It's determined by the crime rate. Okay?
I totally agree,
And I
Sheriff.
agree that conservatives own this issue of law and order. And I find it unfathomable that we would cede this back over to the left and to the Democrats by cuddling up to criminals and thinking that if we are smart on crime, which I really think is being stupid on crime, we need to be serious on crime so that we can continue to control this issue. And where we win it with the public, ladies and gentlemen, it's enforcing the rule of law. It's not having pity for the criminal offender.
Well, my kind of to that
Nobody's
point.
advocating having pity. The reality, though, is the federal government is concentrating on the low-level offender. It ought to be going after the drug traffickers, the organizers, but only 14% are them.
That's a myth. That's a
86%. The statistics are there from the Sentencing Commission, which has liberals as well as conservatives on
Sheriff
there.
Clark,
Judge Pryor is a conservative.
To your point, though, and I don't think that any of us don't want to maintain our tough on crime stance. I like my neighborhood. I like that it's safe. I appreciate the men in blue that are keeping me safe. But when you're having this ballooning prison population, and let's say all of these guys are bad guys, what is your solution to the rising costs? Because as a taxpayer, more and more of my dollars are we going to build bigger jails? What's the solution to that?
All right, first of all, when we say ballooning prison population, it's a culture issue and it's a behavior issue because, like I said, we don't have political prisoners in the United States, all right? These individuals have engaged in some violent and even property crimes. All right, and I'm not suggesting you take somebody on a property crime, a theft, a retail theft, and throw them in federal prison or even state prison. We don't do that. That's part of the myth. Do you know how hard it is to put somebody in prison in the United States of America? Ask any cop on the street how hard it is to get a case charged, to see it all the way through to actual custodial time? It does not happen. Prisons at the federal and state level are reserved for the career criminals who time and time and time again, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times get caught selling drugs. You want to call that a low-level offender? No, that is a repeat career criminal. And like I said, when you live in the ghetto and you're that single mom and you're working your tail off to keep your kid on the straight and narrow, but you know you have to send your kid out into that street, and who's the first person he's going to run into, or see the dope man, you find relief that we keep these individuals locked up. And that's whose side I'm going to stay on, ladies and gentlemen.
Who's more important to go after,
law-abiding
the organizer
citizens,
or,
and I
or
have
the
pity
mule?
for victims of crime, not the criminal perpetrators.
So
Sheriff, who's more important to go after, the organizer of the cartel or the kid on the street who's going to be replaced selling the dope literally
We'll take
before
him
he's
off,
hooked?
you got to work your way up the chain, I think, is what a lot of
But the
prosecutors
reality
would
is it
say.
doesn't work that way. It hasn't worked that way. People rat down the chain. Ratting up the chain results in people shooting you and kidnapping your wife and children. And so they rat down the chain, and the people with the longest sentences end up being the girlfriend who's got nobody to rat out.
Okay.
But I'd like for somebody to explain to me the great crime decline of the 90s and the first decade of 2000. Record lows of violence. How do you explain that? But for the fact that we got serious about crime, not smart about crime, serious about it, and started putting these criminal perpetrators behind bars. Now, when you talk about the cost, $50 billion, I hear, per year across the United States to run corrections agencies. You know what the cost of crime is per year? We never hear about the cost of crime. Rand Corporation did a study. 2010, it's the last year the study's been done. They estimated, and it's a very detailed study, the true cost of crime in the United States of America, $300 billion per year. When you look at funeral costs, hospital costs, you look at wages lost, you look at the more police you need, the more crime that you have, you look at the criminal justice prosecution, you look at insurance rates that go up. When you add all this stuff together, Google the study and look at it. $300 billion a year. If
And
it
how's the
costs
current
$300
system
billion
working?
a year and we pay 50 in corrections, I would say we're not paying enough to drive down the true cost of crime.
How's the current system working? Dope is more available than it was 10 and 20 years ago.
But violent
Despite
crime
this-
rates, I don't.
Violent crime rates are down. But I
and
want to
they are down.
I want to move.
Texas closed 3 prisons, saved $3 billion, and they did it by selectively choosing who to send to prison. Those that are dangerous and violent, while
To the
putting
drug
the
lords.
low-level offenders in treatment. And their crime was at the lowest rate since 1968.
Okay, I want to kind of shift the conversation because we've talked a lot about the protecting the individuals and the cost of that. But what about when you have an offender who goes into prison, and then he comes back out, he does his time, comes back out, is on probation, and then what we see is that about 60%, and the figures here vary, end up going back into jail. As a society, what can we do to rehabilitate these? Is there anything that we can do to rehabilitate these offenders so that they don't go back into their life of crime? Because that's also raising the costs.
Yes.
Mr.
A number of states, Hawaii, has taken people at that point of their process and much more intensively overseen them. And at a certain point, when they get good enough at it, meaning the people providing oversight, that you can actually cut into prison time and do it as oversight with lower recidivism rates and for less money. So that has been attempted, but it isn't with the standard arrangement you have in most states. It's a much more intensive program. One of the things we often see advocated in our conservative states is, look, you can do these few things in your state and you'll spend less money. But you should put that money into rehabilitation, into case management, so you're watching these folks, so that they have actual oversight, whether it's ankle bracelets, whether it's actual visits rather than checking in on the phone, those kinds of things. The more supervision, the more intense that supervision, and it costs dollars to do, the lower your recidivism rates. And there are states that have done that, all kinds of states actually, and have had success with that and saved money doing it.
1/4 of people under correctional supervision are in prison. 90% of our spending goes on them. 3/4 of those under correctional supervision are in the community amongst all of us, and only 10% goes to oversight of them. That makes no sense at all. One of the things we've advocated is beefing up probation and parole so that the case officer can stay in oversight with them, but also so they can make sure they're showing up for their anger management classes, so they show up for their drug tests. In Hawaii, which General Cuccinelli talked about, a study was done of those that went through the HOPE project. New crimes were cut by 50%, and missed probation appointments cut by 68%, and dirty drug tests were cut by 66%. At no extra cost to the government, and in fact, less cost. But it's tough. The judge calls them in and says, we take our rules seriously. Now, you can live by the rules, and we'll try to get you drug treatment, addiction care, help you get job training. You screw up, you don't get 13 errors.
Yeah.
That time, that first time a dirty drug test, you go directly to jail, but only 48 hours. And then they come back for the judge, and he says, now, are you going to be a knucklehead, or are you going to continue, live with the rules? And that's the success they've had. That strict oversight and investing in that, rather than letting them get away with 10 or 13 violations and then sending away for 6 years.
Well, if you talk to probation and parole agents, they'll tell you that their caseload is just much too heavy. They're really not effectively supervising. They have a case to follow some individual, and it really doesn't happen. I got a better idea. What we need to do, instead of trying to undo ingrained criminal behavior, because that's what we're talking about. By the time these individuals reach prison, this is part of their DNA. That's why I call them career criminals. It's what they do. Before it becomes ingrained at a much younger age, let's fix the juvenile justice system so those don't become the future adult prison inmates. How do you do that? Well, there's a number of things that have to happen, and it has to happen at the same time. First of all, and I don't have the answer for this one, I'll tell you, we got to fix families. All right? We have got to fix families.
Yeah.
Criminal behavior starts in crime-prone years, and it's usually, I think they say between 15 and 25 are your crime-prone years. That's where we need to be more effective, not for the people in the prison system, but the people who have done some minor transgressions, and you can see they're on a path to the adult system. And let's interrupt it there. It's going to cost fewer dollars to do that than to try to undo, because if you talk to a behavioral scientist, they'll tell you it is very difficult to undo deeply ingrained criminal behavior. You mentioned there's been some projects that have tried, and yet on a small scale, it looks promising. There are no best practices, by the way. There are promising practices, but Dr. Joan Petersilk, I think Stanford University, she supports these criminal modification programs, but she admits, she says, you know what, when you try to reproduce them to scale, if you do them on a small scale, you can have some results that look promising. But as soon as you start to expand that within that population to try to do it on 100 and 250 and 500 people, she says the returns fall off. So we have to be a little more humble about our ability to change human behavior. But if you don't have punishment as a deterrent to crime, it's going to encourage people to continue. And at least we know this about everybody locked up in prison. They're not committing crimes while they're locked up.
Well, but actually they are. There's more dope available inside prison than
not in my jailers now.
Well,
we got to wrap up for today. But as you can see, this is a very complex topic with a lot of different moving variables. And I think that if you want to learn more about it, looking at the case studies that are done in Hawaii as well as Texas, and the website Right on Crime gives a lot of conservative approaches on how to confront this issue when you're debating about it. All right, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.